Welcome to Life Story 999. Today, we bring you a story of unexpected compassion and transformation. When Lydia Walton, a well-off woman with a deep-rooted sense of control, calls the police on David Grant, a homeless veteran in a public park, the response she gets from the officers takes her by surprise. What unfolds is a journey that challenges prejudice and opens hearts in ways no one anticipated. If you're moved by stories of redemption, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more. Lydia Walton was the kind of woman who prided herself on control. Every aspect of her life was neatly arranged, from her color-coded planner to her picture-perfect suburban home. Her morning walks in Willow Park were an essential part of her routine, a time to clear her mind and admire the pristine beauty of nature. On this particular morning, the air was crisp, and the leaves swayed gently with the breeze as Lydia strolled along the paved paths, her designer sneakers crunching softly on the gravel. As Lydia rounded a corner, she caught sight of a figure on her favorite bench, the one overlooking the serene duck pond. A man was sitting there, slumped over, his head covered by a worn-out baseball cap. His clothes were tattered, and a small backpack lay at his feet. Lydia's initial reaction was one of mild annoyance. This bench was part of her usual route, her spot to take in the calm reflection of the water and gather her thoughts. But the longer she looked at the man, her annoyance shifted to indignation. Lydia noticed his weathered face, the dark tone of his skin, and the weary expression in his eyes. She immediately felt uneasy. In her mind, this was her park, a peaceful oasis in an otherwise chaotic world. And the presence of this stranger, clearly homeless, seemed like an affront to her vision of order. Her eyes narrowed as she approached the bench, her jaw tightening with each step. "Excuse me, but you can't be here," Lydia said, her voice firm and condescending. The man slowly looked up, his eyes clouded from sleep. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he replied softly. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I'll move along." His tone was respectful, almost apologetic, but it did little to soften Lydia's resolve. The man's name was David Grant, a former Marine who had fallen on hard times after returning from his service. Life had not been kind to him since his discharge, but none of this mattered to Lydia. All she saw was someone she perceived as a threat to the sanctity of her precious morning ritual. Lydia crossed her arms over her chest, tapping her foot impatiently as David gathered his few belongings. The unease she felt had now blossomed into something much harsher, a sense of righteousness that fueled her actions. "You know, people like you shouldn't be loitering here," Lydia continued, her voice dripping with disdain. David simply nodded, avoiding her gaze, and slowly stood up, his shoulders slumped in resignation. He had heard words like this before, countless times, and he knew better than to argue. He was used to the judgmental looks, the harsh comments, the way people would act as if his presence alone was a personal affront. He lifted his backpack onto his shoulder and began to walk away. But for Lydia, that wasn't enough. The fact that he had been there at all irked her. She wanted this place, her sanctuary, free from anything that disrupted its tranquility. Without hesitation, she pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed the police. As she spoke, her voice took on a tone of exaggerated fear, painting a picture of a threatening stranger, making her feel unsafe. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person at Willow Park," she said, glancing towards David, who was slowly moving down the path. "He's acting erratically, and I don't feel safe. Please send someone quickly." The other park-goers began to notice the situation. A few joggers slowed their pace, their eyes flicking curiously between Lydia and the retreating figure of David. An elderly man feeding the ducks watched, shaking his head slightly, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Lydia, however, remained resolute, her focus solely on ensuring that her complaint was taken seriously. David continued his slow walk away from the bench, unaware that he was now the subject of an emergency call. He just wanted to find somewhere else to rest, somewhere where he wouldn't be bothered. He had learned to be invisible, to move quietly through places where he wasn't welcome. But today, even that wasn't enough. Lydia ended the call, a small smile of satisfaction playing on her lips. She straightened her posture, adjusting her bright pink workout jacket, feeling a sense of accomplishment. In her mind, she was doing her civic duty, protecting her community from anything she deemed out of place. As she resumed her walk, Lydia barely noticed the whispers and stares from the people around her. To her, she had simply restored order, ensuring that Willow Park remained the kind of place it was meant to be, peaceful, safe, and exactly how she liked it. Officers Mark Diaz and Rachel Porter arrived at Willow Park just minutes after Lydia's call. The sirens that had blared through the otherwise quiet neighborhood were now silenced, leaving only the hushed murmur of onlookers and the sound of birds overhead. Officer Diaz stepped out of the police cruiser, his eyes scanning the area until they landed on Lydia, standing near the duck pond with her phone still in her hand. Officer Porter followed, her eyes similarly sharp and alert. Lydia waved them over, her face flushed with a mix of frustration and determination. "Thank goodness you're here," she began, her voice taking on a dramatic tone. "There was a man. He was acting very suspicious, and he was refusing to leave. I felt very unsafe." She gestured towards David, who was now standing a short distance away, leaning against a tree, his eyes downcast. Officer Diaz nodded, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he listened to Lydia's description. He had been on the force long enough to recognize when something didn't quite add up. The man Lydia was describing didn't seem to match the individual he saw before him. A tired, older man with a backpack, clearly worn from being on the streets. There was no aggression in his posture, no sign of erratic behavior. "All right, ma'am. We'll take it from here," Diaz said, his voice steady, as he and Officer Porter approached David. Lydia watched, expecting them to immediately order David to leave or perhaps even arrest him. Instead, Diaz took a different approach. "Sir, could you tell me your name?" Diaz asked, his voice calm. David looked up, meeting the officer's gaze for a moment before glancing back down. "David Grant," he said quietly. "Mr. Grant, do you mind telling us what's going on here?" Officer Porter added, her tone gentle. David shifted on his feet, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just resting, officer. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I'll move along if I need to." Officer Diaz paused, noticing the subtle tension in David's shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes. There was something familiar about the way David carried himself, a certain quiet dignity mixed with weariness. Diaz had seen it before, in the veterans he knew, in the people who had given everything only to struggle upon their return to civilian life. "Mr. Grant," Diaz said, his voice softening, "were you in the service?" David hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir. Marine Corps. 20 years. A flicker of recognition passed over Diaz's face. "Thank you for your service," he said, extending his hand. David looked up, surprised, before shaking the officer's hand. The exchange was brief but sincere, a gesture that conveyed respect. Lydia, standing a few steps away, frowned, her confusion growing. This was not the outcome she had envisioned. Officer Porter, observing the interaction, offered David a small smile. "Mr. Grant, are you in need of any assistance? Housing, food, anything like that?" she asked. David shrugged, a defeated look crossing his face. "I've tried the shelters, ma'am. The waiting lists are long. I just needed a place to rest for a bit." Diaz nodded, his expression thoughtful. He turned back to Lydia, who was watching with her arms crossed, impatience evident on her face. "Ma'am, Mr. Grant hasn't committed any crime. He's not a threat to anyone here." Lydia's eyes widened, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "But he's loitering. He shouldn't be here, making people uncomfortable. I called because I thought—" "I understand your concern," Diaz interrupted, his tone remaining calm but firm. "However, public parks are for everyone, and Mr. Grant has a right to be here just as much as anyone else." The small crowd that had gathered began to murmur, a few nodding in agreement. Lydia felt her face flush with embarrassment. This wasn't the outcome she had expected. She had envisioned the officers swiftly removing David, restoring her sense of order. Instead, they were treating him with dignity, as if he were an equal. Officer Porter turned back to David. "Mr. Grant, we can connect you with a local outreach program. They might be able to help expedite some services for you." She handed him a small card with a phone number on it. David took it, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. "Thank you, officers," he said quietly. "I'll give them a call." Diaz nodded. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Grant. And if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." With that, he gave David a respectful nod before turning back towards the police cruiser. Porter followed, giving Lydia a polite but pointed look as they passed. Lydia stood there, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. She had expected validation, a confirmation that her actions were justified. Instead, she felt a growing sense of doubt, a gnawing feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. The officers had treated David like a person, not a problem to be removed. It was a perspective Lydia hadn't considered, and it unsettled her. As the officers drove away, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Lydia remained by the duck pond, her mind replaying the events that had just unfolded. She watched as David, with slow, deliberate steps, walked towards the edge of the park, the small card still clutched in his hand. He paused for a moment, looking back towards a pond, before continuing on his way. Lydia took a deep breath, her chest tight. For the first time, she felt something she couldn't quite name, a mixture of regret, unease, and perhaps a sliver of understanding. She had always thought of herself as someone who did the right thing, who protected her community. But today, the lines between right and wrong had blurred, leaving her with questions she wasn't sure how to answer. Willow Park, once her sanctuary, now felt different. The air seemed heavier. The tranquility she sought replaced by an uncomfortable awareness. As she turned to leave, Lydia couldn't help but glance back at the path David had taken, a small part of her wondering if she had truly seen him for who he was, or merely who she had assumed him to be. David Grant hesitated as he stood there, the small card in his hand, the officers watching him with understanding eyes. He had been offered help before, but every time, it felt like a door that only opened halfway, a glimpse of hope that ended in more waiting, more paperwork, and more empty promises. But something about the sincerity in Officer Diaz and Officer Porter's voices made him pause. Maybe this time could be different. He took a deep breath and began to share his story. "It hasn't been easy," David began, his voice rough but steady. "After I got out of the Marine Corps, I thought I'd be able to start fresh. But things don't always work out that way. I came back with a lot of memories, things I don't like to talk about. Pity is real, you know?" He glanced up at Diaz, who nodded silently, a flicker of empathy in his eyes. "I tried to hold a job," David continued, "but it's hard when your mind plays tricks on you and you can't sleep at night. Employers don't want to hear about it. They just want someone who can get the job done. After a while, it got harder to keep up. I ended up losing my place. The friends I had, well, they had their own lives. I didn't want to be a burden." He paused, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "So here I am." Officer Porter listened, her expression softening as David spoke. She could hear the exhaustion in his voice, the weight of someone who had fought battles, both overseas and within himself, and had come home only to face another kind of war. "Mr. Grant," she said gently, "I can't imagine what you've been through, but I want you to know that there are people who care. The Veteran Center, they have programs specifically for folks like you. Housing assistance, therapy, we can help you get in touch with them." David sighed, the hesitation still evident. "I've tried before," he said, his voice barely audible. "The waiting lists are long. It feels like they forget about you once you're out. But I guess I could try again." He looked down at the card, the name and number printed neatly on it. Officer Diaz put a reassuring hand on David's shoulder. "It's worth a shot," he said. Sometimes it takes a few tries, but you can't give up. You've already made it through worse. Let us help you this time. Nearby, Lydia watched the exchange, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest. She was close enough to hear David's words. The struggle, the vulnerability. It was a side of him she hadn't considered. In her eyes, he had been nothing more than an intruder in her orderly life, someone disrupting the peace she held dear. But now, seeing the way the officers treated him, listening to the pain in his voice, something began to shift inside her. It was a small, uncomfortable feeling, a sense of guilt that gnawed at the edges of her certainty. Lydia had called the police expecting them to confirm her fears, to back up her belief that she was right to feel threatened. But instead, they had approached David with empathy, with respect. It made her wonder if she had misjudged him, if she had let her own fears and assumptions cloud her judgment. She glanced down at her phone, the call history still showing the 911 call she had made only moments earlier. Her finger hovered over the screen, a sudden impulse to delete the record. It felt wrong now, as if her actions had been hasty, fueled by prejudice rather than genuine concern. David glanced up, meeting Officer Porter's eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "It's just hard to trust that things will change. But I'll try." Porter smiled. "That's all we ask, Mr. Grant. One step at a time." She nodded towards the direction of the park's exit. "If you like, we can give you a ride to the Veterans Center, or anywhere you'd feel comfortable going." David shook his head. "I'll walk for now," he said. "Gives me time to think." He looked at the officers, a mixture of gratitude and wariness in his expression. "But thank you. I appreciate it more than you know." Officer Diaz nodded. "Take care of yourself, David. You're not alone in this." With that, he and Porter stepped back, giving David space. They watched as he turned and slowly began to make his way down the path, his steps deliberate but with a renewed sense of purpose. Lydia remained by the pond, her gaze following David as he walked away. She felt something stir within her, a mix of regret and a dawning realization that maybe the world wasn't as black and white as she had always believed. People weren't just good or bad, deserving or undeserving. There were layers, stories behind each face she passed. And today, she had glimpsed a part of David's story that she hadn't expected. The officers walked back towards their cruiser, their faces thoughtful. As they passed Lydia, Officer Diaz gave her a nod, a gesture that seemed to carry more meaning now than it had before. Lydia nodded back, her expression uncertain. She knew that today had changed something in her, though she wasn't quite sure what that meant yet. All she knew was that the park didn't feel quite the same, and perhaps neither did she. Lydia Walton sat in her living room later that day, her mind restless. The encounter at Willow Park replayed over and over, like a loop that wouldn't end. She had always prided herself on being a good citizen, someone who looked out for her community, someone who wasn't afraid to step in when something seemed out of place. She thought of herself as upholding community standards, keeping things orderly and safe. But now, after everything that had happened, she wasn't so sure anymore. Lydia scrolled through her social media feed, hoping to distract herself, but it seemed like everyone else had different ideas. Several posts from local community groups had already started circulating about the incident in the park. She saw her own face in one of the videos, recorded by a bystander, she guessed. There she was, standing by the duck pond, her expression stern, while Officers Diaz and Porter spoke calmly with David Grant. The captions beneath the video were enough to make her stomach twist. Local woman calls police on homeless veteran, one read. Another added, officers show compassion as bystander shows none. Lydia felt her face flush with embarrassment as she read through the comments. People were sympathizing with David. They spoke of his courage, of how he was clearly struggling, but still trying to make his way. They praised the officers for their empathy and questioned why someone would feel the need to call the police on a man simply resting on a park bench. She hadn't expected this. In her mind, she had been doing the right thing, protecting her neighborhood from someone she thought didn't belong there. But now, reading these comments, seeing how others viewed her actions, she felt a deep unease. Had she really misjudged the situation so badly? Had she let her own fears and biases dictate her actions? The weight of it pressed down on her, a gnawing feeling that made her chest tight. She thought back to the look on David's face when Officer Diaz had asked him if he'd served. She remembered the way his shoulders slumped when he spoke about trying to find work, about losing his place. It had been so easy for her to see him as a threat, as someone who didn't belong. But the officers hadn't seen him that way at all. They had treated him like a person, with respect and understanding. And the more she thought about it, the more Lydia realized how wrong she had been. The guilt settled in, heavy and uncomfortable. Lydia closed her laptop and stood up, pacing across her living room. She had always thought of herself as someone who helped make the community better. But what if she had been part of the problem instead? What if her actions had only made things worse for people like David, who were already struggling just to get by? The thought made her stomach churn. She walked over to the window, looking out at the street below. Everything looked so normal. Cars passing by, people walking their dogs, children playing. But she knew that beneath the surface, everyone had their own struggles, their own stories. Just like David, she had been so quick to judge, to assume that he didn't belong simply because he didn't fit into her idea of what was proper for the park. But the park wasn't hers. It belonged to everyone, including people like David. Lydia took a deep breath, her mind racing. She needed to do something to make this right, or at least try to. She wasn't sure what that meant yet, but she knew she couldn't just let it go. Maybe she could volunteer at the Veteran Center, or find a way to support people in her community who were struggling. She didn't know if it would make a difference, but she had to try. She couldn't stand the thought of being the kind of person who looked away, who only cared about her own comfort. The next day, Lydia found herself at her computer, typing a post. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, hesitation gripping her. She wasn't used to admitting when she was wrong, especially not in front of the whole community. But she knew she needed to. She needed to acknowledge what had happened, to take responsibility for her actions. Finally, she began to type. To everyone who witnessed the events at Willow Park yesterday, she wrote, I want to sincerely apologize for my actions. I realize now that I acted out of fear and judgment, and I deeply regret the pain I may have caused Mr. Grant. I thought I was protecting my community, but I see now that I was wrong. I want to do better, and I hope to learn from this experience. She read over the words, her heart pounding. It wasn't enough, she knew that. An apology couldn't undo what had happened, but it was a start. It was her way of acknowledging the truth, of beginning to change. She clicked post, and then leaned back in her chair, a deep breath escaping her lips. Lydia knew she had a long way to go. There were no quick fixes, no easy ways to make amends. But she was willing to try, to learn, to be better. She thought of David, of the way he had looked as he walked away from the park. Tired, but with a quiet determination. She wanted to find that kind of strength within herself, to face her own flaws and work towards something better. As she sat there, staring at the screen, Lydia felt a shift within her. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a change in the way she saw herself and the world around her. For the first time in a long time, she felt unsure. And maybe that was a good thing. Maybe it meant she was finally ready to see the world as it truly was, rather than how she wanted it to be. Several days had passed since the incident at Willow Park, and Lydia Walton had found herself feeling restless. The regret and unease from that day lingered, and she knew she needed to do something about it. It was this sense of restlessness that had led her to a local soup kitchen, where she had reluctantly signed up to volunteer. Lydia wasn't entirely sure what she was doing there. Maybe she wanted to atone for her mistakes, or maybe she just wanted to feel like she was making a difference. Either way, she was there, and she had decided to give it a try. The soup kitchen was bustling with activity. The scent of warm soup and freshly baked bread filled the air, and the clatter of dishes and chatter of volunteers and guests created a lively atmosphere. Lydia stood by the counter, helping ladle soup into bowls, her mind still swirling with thoughts of that day in the park. She was so caught up in her own thoughts that she almost didn't notice him. David Grant, standing at the other end of the room, speaking with one of the other volunteers. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She watched as David smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he chatted with the volunteers. He looked different here, more at ease, more himself. He wasn't the weary man she had seen sitting on the park bench. Instead, he seemed confident, even joyful, as he helped serve the guests, offering kind words and a warm smile to everyone who came through the line. She couldn't help but watch him. Her curiosity piqued. David moved through the room with a sense of purpose, greeting people by name, asking how they were doing. He was clearly well liked here, and Lydia could see why. There was a kindness in his demeanor, a genuine warmth that seemed to draw people in. The more she watched, the more she realized how wrong she had been about him. He wasn't a threat. He was a man who had faced challenges she couldn't even begin to understand, yet he still found it within himself to give back, to care for others. At one point, David glanced in her direction and their eyes met. Lydia felt a flush of embarrassment rise to her cheeks, but David simply gave her a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. She nodded back, a hesitant smile forming on her lips. She wasn't sure if he recognized her from the park, but either way, his kindness was evident. He wasn't holding a grudge, and that made something in Lydia's chest loosen, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. As the day went on, Lydia found herself drawn to David's presence. She watched as he interacted with the other volunteers, his laughter echoing through the room, his gentle words of encouragement bringing smiles to people's faces. She could see how much he cared, how much he wanted to make a difference. And slowly, she began to feel a desire to do the same. During a brief lull in the activity, Lydia found herself standing next to David at the counter. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Hi," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I'm Lydia. I've seen you around here today. You seem to know everyone." David turned to her, a friendly smile on his face. "Hey, Lydia. Yeah, I've been coming here for a while now. It's a good place. Helps keep me grounded, you know." Lydia nodded, unsure of what to say next. She wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words felt stuck in her throat. Instead, she said, "It's really great what you're doing here. I can see that you care a lot about these people." David looked at her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he nodded. "I do. I've been where some of them are. It's not easy. But sometimes all it takes is a little kindness to make a big difference." His words struck a chord with Lydia. She had always thought of kindness as something small, something that didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But seeing David here, seeing the impact he was having, made her realize just how powerful it could be. Kindness wasn't small. It was everything. Over the next few days, Lydia and David found themselves talking more and more. Their conversations were light at first, about the soup kitchen, about the people who came in for meals. But gradually, they began to share more. Lydia learned about David's time in the Marine Corps, about the friends he had lost, about the struggles he had faced when he returned home. He spoke about his PTSD, about the nights he couldn't sleep, about the battles he fought long after the war was over. In turn, Lydia began to open up as well. She spoke about her own fears, about the pressure she had always felt to be perfect, to uphold a certain image. She told David about the day in the park, about how she had called the police, thinking she was doing the right thing. She expected him to be angry, to tell her off for judging him so harshly. But David just listened, his expression gentle. "We all make mistakes," he said quietly. "What matters is what we do after. You're here now, trying to understand. That's what counts." Lydia felt a lump form in her throat at his words. She had expected judgment, but instead, she found understanding. It was humbling, and it made her want to be better. not just for herself, but for people like David, who deserved more than the world had given them. One afternoon, as they were cleaning up after the lunch rush, Lydia turned to David. "I want to do more," she said. "I want to help, really help. Not just here, but however I can." David looked at her, a smile spreading across his face. "That's good to hear," he said. "There's always more we can do. And you know what? It starts with small steps. Just like this." Lydia nodded, a sense of purpose beginning to take root within her. For so long, she had been focused on keeping her world neat and orderly, on keeping things under control. But now, she realized that real change, real growth, came from stepping out of that comfort zone, from facing the messy, complicated reality of life head-on. And maybe, just maybe, that was where she would find the person she truly wanted to be. As Lydia spent more time with David at the soup kitchen, her remorse for her actions at Willow Park deepened. She couldn't shake the memory of the harsh words she had used, the assumptions she had made without ever knowing his story. It weighed heavily on her, especially as she began to understand more about David's life, his sacrifices, his pain, and his resilience. Day after day, she watched him extend kindness to everyone he met, his spirit unbroken despite everything he had faced. It was humbling, and it made her realize just how wrong she had been. One afternoon, as they were cleaning up after the lunch rush, Lydia knew it was time. She had to say the words that had been caught in her throat for weeks. She turned to David, her heart pounding. "David," she began, her voice soft, "I need to apologize to you for everything." David paused, looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and warmth. "You don't have to," he started, but Lydia shook her head. "No, I do," she insisted. "I was wrong that day in the park. I made assumptions about you without knowing anything about who you are or what you've been through. I acted out of fear, and I hurt you. I'm so sorry for that." Her voice wavered, and she took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "I know I can't change what I did, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better." David was silent for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "Lydia," he said, "we all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them. You're here now, trying to understand, trying to help. That means a lot more than you think." His words were like a weight lifting off her shoulders. Lydia felt a rush of emotion, a mix of gratitude and relief. She had expected anger, maybe even rejection, but instead, she found forgiveness, a kind of grace she hadn't known she needed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make it right." David nodded, his expression kind. "It's not about making it right," he said. "It's about moving forward. We're all just trying to do our best, one day at a time." Their conversation marked a turning point for Lydia. She no longer saw David as just a man from the park, nor as a symbol of her guilt. He had become a friend, someone who had shown her the power of empathy and understanding. Their unlikely friendship grew stronger with each passing day, a testament to the transformative power of humility and redemption. Lydia had learned that true change started from within. It wasn't enough to feel guilty or regretful. She had to act, to confront her own biases and fears. And with David's encouragement, she did just that. She continued to volunteer, not just at the soup kitchen, but also at the Veterans Center, finding ways to support others who were struggling. Through her journey, Lydia discovered that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, growing beyond it, and choosing to be better. And as she stood side by side with David, serving those in need, she knew that the person she was becoming was someone she could finally be proud of. Lydia and David began working together on community projects aimed at helping homeless veterans. It was David's idea to expand their efforts beyond the soup kitchen, and Lydia was eager to support him. They started organizing donation drives for clothing and essentials, working with local businesses to raise funds, and coordinating workshops to help veterans find employment opportunities. Lydia's life had shifted completely. from one of maintaining her personal comfort to one of genuine service to others. David, with his experience and deep understanding of what veterans faced, was the guiding force behind their efforts. Lydia, meanwhile, used her connections and organizational skills to rally support from the community. Together, they made an effective team, each contributing their strengths to the cause. They spent countless hours planning, meeting with other volunteers, and speaking with veterans to better understand their needs. The bond between Lydia and David grew stronger, forged through their shared mission and mutual respect. One afternoon, as they were wrapping up a workshop at the Veterans Center, Lydia took a moment to look around the room. She saw David talking to a group of veterans, his laughter echoing through the space, and she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what mattered, connecting with people, making a difference, and lifting others up. It was a far cry from the woman she had been before, focused on her own routines and prejudices. The change in her life had been profound, and it all traced back to that one moment in the park. Reflecting on everything that had happened, Lydia realized how much that encounter had transformed her. It had opened her eyes to her own flaws, to the biases she hadn't even realized she held. More importantly, it had given her the chance to grow, to step beyond her own comfort zone, and to make a meaningful impact on others' lives. She knew that her journey was far from over, but with David by her side, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The park was no longer just a place for her morning walks. It had become a symbol of change, of new beginnings. And as she stood there with David, both of them committed to helping those in need, Lydia felt a sense of peace. One small encounter had changed everything, and for that, she would always be grateful. This story reveals the power of change and understanding. Lydia's journey from judgment to compassion reminds us of the importance of empathy and second chances. If this story moved you, please comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to Life Story 999 for more inspiring stories.